The morning they read my brother's will, my daughter-in-law looked across the conference table at me and said, loud enough for the estate attorney to hear, "He probably doesn't even understand what half these documents mean." I didn't respond. I just folded my hands on the table and waited. The attorney looked up from his papers. He studied me for a moment, the kind of look that carries a question behind it. Then he looked back down and kept reading. My daughter-in-law smiled. She thought the silence meant she was right. She had no idea what that silence actually meant. "My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government, the last 12 of which I worked directly with the Department of Justice tracking financial fraud and estate disputes and family asset cases. I've sat in more rooms like that conference room than I can count. I know exactly what every line of a legal document means. I know what the numbers are supposed to say. And more importantly, I know when the numbers have been changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My brother Raymond passed away in October, after 18 months of illness. Pancreatic cancer. He was 67, 4 years older than me, and for most of our adult lives we were close. The kind of close that doesn't need weekly phone calls or scheduled visits. But when you're in the same room, it's like no time has passed at all. He was a good man. He built a small manufacturing business from nothing, sold it at 60 for more than most people earn in 10 lifetimes, and spent his final years doing exactly what he always said he would: fishing, reading, and sitting on the porch of the house he bought in western North Carolina. When Raymond got sick, his son, my nephew Derek, moved back from Atlanta to help manage things. Derek was 41, recently remarried, and his new wife Renata came with him. I had met Renata twice before Raymond's diagnosis. Both times she had been perfectly pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they're being careful. I didn't think much of it then. I thought plenty of it later. Raymond asked me to visit in the spring, about 8 months before he died. We sat on his porch and watched the mountains go blue in the late afternoon light, and he said to me, "Walt, I need you to be the executor of my estate." I told him I would. He said, "And I need you to watch Derek." I asked him what he meant. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Renata handles all his finances now. He doesn't even know what's in his own checking account. And lately I've noticed things, small things. But you know how small things add up." I did know. That was my entire career. I asked Raymond if he wanted me to look into it then. He shook his head. "Not yet. I don't want the last months to be a war. Just watch. And when the time comes, do what you do." So I watched. Renata was smart. I'll give her that. She knew enough to be subtle, which meant she had either done this before, or she had studied how not to get caught. She started with access. Within 2 weeks of moving into Raymond's house to help with care, she had positioned herself as the point of contact for his home health aid agency, his pharmacy, and his financial advisor. She told Raymond it was to spare him the stress. He was exhausted and in pain, and it probably did feel like relief in the beginning. I visited twice during those months. Each time I made a point of being pleasant and unassuming. I asked no hard questions. I brought Raymond's favorite coffee from the place in Asheville he liked, and I sat with him and let him talk about fishing and about our father and about things that had nothing to do with money. Renata relaxed around me quickly. People tend to underestimate men my age who don't assert themselves loudly. We look like we've already given up. That's always been my advantage. What I was actually doing during those visits and in the months between them was building a file. Raymond had given me limited power of attorney specifically for estate-related matters, which meant I had the legal right to request documentation. I did so quietly, routing requests through a former colleague who now worked in private estate law, I didn't want Renata to see my name on anything until I was ready. By the time Raymond passed, I had 14 months of financial records. The patterns were not subtle once you knew what to look for. Raymond's investment accounts had been partially liquidated, not all at once, which would have triggered alerts, but in increments small enough to avoid automatic review. The funds were routed through a joint account that Renata had opened with Derek, framing it to Raymond's financial advisor as a family expense management account for caregiving costs. Some of the money genuinely did cover caregiving expenses. The rest went somewhere else. Vacation bookings in Derek's name. A down payment on a property in Florida registered to an LLC that Renata had formed 6 months before Raymond's diagnosis. A transfer to an account I traced back to Renata's sister. Approximately $480,000 over 14 months. Raymond's estate, by the terms of his will, was to be divided primarily between Derek and 3 charitable organizations Raymond had supported for decades: a Veterans Foundation, a children's literacy nonprofit, and the small rural hospital where our mother had been treated for the last years of her life. There was also a modest specific bequest to me, which I had not known about and which, frankly, made the whole thing harder to hold together emotionally when I first read the will. As executor, it was my legal obligation to ensure the estate was distributed accurately. That meant the missing $480,000 was not a family matter. It was a fiduciary matter. I retained an estate litigation attorney named Patricia, a woman I had worked adjacent to on a federal case 12 years ago, who had since built one of the most respected estate dispute practices in the region. I gave her everything. She reviewed it for 2 weeks and came back to me and said simply, "Walter, this is clean. This is a very clean case." We did not file immediately. We filed 3 weeks after the initial estate meeting, the one where Renata had made her comment about me not understanding the documents. That meeting had been informative in other ways, too. Derek sat across from me looking uncomfortable in the way that people look when they know something is wrong, but have convinced themselves they don't need to think about it. Renata sat beside him, organized and attentive, asking pointed questions about timelines and distributions, steering the conversation with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already decided how things were going to go. At one point, she said, "Walter, I hope you understand that Derek and I are going to need access to the estate accounts during probate for ongoing family expenses." I said, "I understand that's what you'd like." She waited for more. I didn't give her more. My son, Marcus, was with me that day. He's 38, an engineer, steady and quiet, the way his mother raised him to be. Afterward, in the parking lot, he said to me, "Dad, what's going on?" I told him I couldn't discuss it yet, but that I needed him to trust me for a few more weeks. He looked at me for a long moment and then nodded. Marcus has always understood that when I ask for patience, there's a reason. Derek called me 4 days after that meeting. He was friendly, almost aggressively so, asking about my health, asking about Marcus, working up to something that he then dressed in very casual language. Whether I had flexibility as executor, whether there were ways to expedite certain distributions, whether the charitable bequests might be revisited, given that Raymond had been, in Derek's words, not entirely himself in his final months. I let him talk. Then I said, "Derek, I'm going to do exactly what Raymond asked me to do." There was a long pause. He said, "Right, of course. I just thought—" I said, "I know what you thought." And I ended the call. Renata called 2 days later. Her approach was different, more direct, less warm. She said she wanted to make sure I understood that they had documentation of all the caregiving expenses from the past year, that Derek had sacrificed significantly to be present for his father, and that it would be fair for the estate to account for that. I told her I had reviewed all the documentation thoroughly. Another pause. Then she said, I hope we can handle this as a family. I said, I hope so too. I meant something different by it than she did. Patricia filed the civil complaint on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, Derek had retained his own attorney. By Thursday, Renata had hired a second one, separately. That told me everything I needed to know about the state of their marriage. The hearing was scheduled for late January, 8 weeks after we filed. I drove up to Asheville the night before and stayed at the same small inn where Raymond and I had stayed years ago when we came up for a long weekend of hiking before either of our knees made hiking a memory. I ordered room service and sat by the window and looked at the mountains going dark and thought about my brother. I thought about that afternoon on the porch. I thought about him saying, "You know how small things add up." He had spent his whole life building something real. He deserved to have it go where he intended. I slept better than I expected. The courtroom was small and wood-paneled, the kind that feels more functional than formal. But the judge, a woman in her mid-50s named Judge Caroline Marsh, ran it with a precision that I recognized and respected. She had the manner of someone who had heard every variety of human dishonesty and had developed a complete immunity to performance. Renata's attorney, a man named Colton, opened by characterizing the complaint as a family dispute driven by executor overreach, suggesting that I had a personal financial interest in the outcome given my own bequest, and that my interpretation of the financial records was subjective and agenda-driven. He was polished. He used the word unfortunate several times in ways that were meant to make me seem small. When it was Patricia's turn, she didn't editorialize. She simply walked through the documentation, account records, transfer histories, LLC registration, property deed, bank statements showing destination accounts. Each one projected on the courtroom screen in the clear labeled format that I had spent 3 decades learning to produce. The kind of format that doesn't require explanation, the kind that speaks before anyone in the room opens their mouth. At one point, Judge Marsh stopped the proceedings. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at Renata's attorney. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, the way the estate attorney had looked at me at that first meeting, but with something more specific in her expression. She said, "Mr. Colton, I want to understand your client's position. Are you suggesting that the executor, a man who spent 3 decades doing this exact work for the federal government, misread these transfers accidentally? Or are you suggesting he fabricated them?" Colton hesitated. "Your Honor, we're not suggesting fabrication." "Then what are you suggesting?" He adjusted his posture. "We're suggesting that the characterization of these transfers as fraudulent is—" "I can read what they are," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me what your client says they are." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. I looked at Renata. She was very still. The composed, organized woman from the conference table looked like someone who had just realized that the room she was in was not the room she had prepared for. Derek was sitting apart from her, which I noticed for the first time in that moment. 3 chairs of distance between them on the same bench. His attorney sat beside him. Renata's attorney sat beside her. The physical arrangement told a story all on its own. Derek caught me looking. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted in a way that I recognized. The exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something they knew was wrong and finally doesn't have to pretend anymore. I had seen that look in depositions. I had learned early in my career that the look often preceded cooperation. I was right about that. Derek's attorney submitted a statement on his behalf later that afternoon. Derek had not been fully aware of the scope of the transfers. He acknowledged that Renata had managed the finances and that he had, in his own words, chosen not to look closely. He agreed to cooperate with a full accounting. He waived any claim to the disputed amounts. I won't say I felt satisfaction in that moment. What I felt was closer to grief. For Derek, who had let himself be managed into something he would spend years recovering from. For my brother, who had watched it happening and hadn't had the strength left to stop it. For the way that love and trust can be turned into a mechanism by people who know how to work them. Judge Marsh issued her preliminary ruling 6 weeks later. The transfers were found to constitute fraudulent conversion of estate assets. The Florida property, the LLC, and the accounts were ordered frozen pending recovery proceedings. The full estate was to be administered as originally drafted. The charitable organizations Raymond had believed in would receive what he intended for them. The hospital where our mother had spent her last years would get its bequest. Renata faced a separate referral for civil fraud. I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom afterward, and Marcus was beside me, and he put his hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" It wasn't quite a question. I said, "Your uncle asked me to watch. I watched." Marcus nodded. He said, "He picked the right person." That meant more to me than the ruling. What I want to say, to anyone who has watched someone they love be taken advantage of by people who mistook patience for ignorance, is this: silence is not absence. It is not weakness. It is not confusion. Sometimes it is the most deliberate thing a person can do. The woman at that table, who said I probably didn't understand the documents, was counting on a story she had written about me in her head. The old man, past his prime, out of his depth. People write those stories about men my age all the time. I have spent my career being underestimated, and I have spent my career letting it happen. Because the moment someone believes you don't understand is the moment they stop being careful. Raymond built something real. He wanted it to go to people and causes that mattered to him. That's what happened. I drove home through the mountains in late afternoon light. The same light that had been falling across that porch when my brother asked me to watch. And I thought about how some things close the way they should. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the quiet weight of the truth finally landing where it belongs. The coffee shop in Asheville was still open when I passed it. I stopped and got 2 cups, one for the road, one that I held for a moment and then set on the passenger seat, the way you do when you're still in the habit of bringing something back for someone. I drove the rest of the way home with the mountains behind me and both cups cooling in the dark.